underpinning our lifestyles is at record levels. The mindset that we'll be happier and more popular if we buy more, spend more, travel more and eat more is because... So the average world per capita primary energy has just gone up and up and up and up, pushing us to an extreme point. And we know it's causing problems. Unfortunately, 195 countries came together in Paris and agreed targets that were very much more ambitious than many of us thought, particularly due to the high ambition coalition that came together, pushing for 1.5 that will protect the most vulnerable countries. But then in Paris, all the countries agreed a target, but they also offered their initial actions of what they will do, their Paris pledges on behalf of each country. And then when analysts like Climate Action Tracker added them up, you find if everybody does what they've committed to do in Paris, well, it warms the world to 2.8 degrees at least, more like 3.5 if America withdraws. So the agreement and the target is good, but the actions to deliver that target are well less than the evidence demands, which is really serious. Fortunately, the people who devised the Paris process sort of guessed that might happen, so they built into the process what they call the Paris ratchet mechanism, where there are 3 strategic reviews where we have to rethink the pledges that we've made. Every country has to look at the evidence and offer more ambition. And the serious aspect is that the first of these is this year in Poland, in Katowice, in December, where the world will come back together, and we must offer more ambition. The challenge is that nobody's talking about it. It's not on television, none of your analysts are looking at it. We're all been distracted by other things, like Donald Trump, like Brexit. Now, this year is a very interesting year because the president of the COP, Fijian president, Frank, he sort of said, well, we need to have a process for dealing with this. And he introduced the Talanoa dialogue. Now, Talanoa is a word we don't have in our culture. It's a Fijian word that means coming together for the common good. And as part of that, there are Talanoa dialogues happening across the world, and they've opened a Talanoa dialogue portal on the UN website where countries can offer pieces of information that are useful, and it will all be sorted and fed to the delegates and fed into the process. So it's a very interesting opportunity. And particularly to sort of help us understand where we are now, where we need to be and how we get there. They're the 3 fundamental questions of the Talanoa Dialogue portal. Well worth having a look. Because basically we're on the wrong side of a yawning chasm. Essentially, there's a huge gap between what's been offered, which fits with politics as usual, and what the actual physics of the rate of decarbonisation, of the area under the curve, demands. So what we do is we root ourselves in this side and say, let's look at the rates of decarbonisation that the physics demands. And basically, if we're going to take people there, we can say, well, let's close our eyes, let's imagine ourselves in a world where we've solved the climate challenge, and what would that be like? And that's a positive thing to do. But if we're then going to go out and convince our other councils, we're going to convince our friends and neighbours to do that, we need an evidence base behind it. So what we've been doing is helping people have the evidence base for the optimism we need to overcome the seriousness of the challenge. And so the root of it is to understand where we are now. I mean, we're giving off about 650 million tonnes of carbon dioxide every year. 550 from that comes from burning fossil fuels. There's some emissions from industrial process, quite a lot from land use. But the amount that's actually been locked up by natural systems, which is the other side of zero, of course natural systems lock up carbon, they have done for millions of years, but it's nowhere near in balance. The amount that's locked up by forest and grassland and wood products is nowhere near enough. So we need to look at how we can bring this system back into balance. So that's what Zero Carbon Britain does. It's evidence-based research that looks at, we talk to the climate scientists, we understand how fast we need to do it, and then we begin doing modelling to help give the power to the elbow to the communities and the politicians to have more ambition. 2 fundamental processes: is powering down from energy extreme normality and then powering up indigenous clean renewables. We set ourselves some assumptions, just like David Mackay does in all of his models. We can't rely on any future technologies that don't exist yet. We must minimize impacts on quality of life to make it easier for society to transition, and we must consider adaptation. Now, I'm going to have to rattle through this because normally we do this in a 2-day training course. I've got about 25 minutes left, so basically I've brought the 6-page summaries. It's all here for you to read, but it's all free to download from the website. We've got videos that explain it, but I'm going to tell you that it's there and what it says. Power down. Essentially, we calculated you can power down by about 60% over 2 decades by rethinking extreme energy normality and looking at the 4 key sectors of buildings, heating, lighting, cooking appliances, industry, transport, and looking at how we can rethink those. Now, industry, we gave industry the same amount of energy because we're going to be really, really busy in the next 20 years, but we're shifting the source of energy from mostly fossil fuels to mostly clean renewables. So industry gets more or less the same, but for other sectors, we can make massive reductions. Buildings, heating and hot water, we can drop from 600 terawatt hours per year, which was the 2010 baseline, down to about 230, of which 100 terawatt hours is ambient heat through heat pumps. And we do that more or less, if you look at a typical house in the UK, about 10,000 kilowatt hours per year. If we insulate the walls, the roof, the floor, better drafts, reduction, double glaze it, think about better controls, and only heat the rooms you need to heat, you can make significant reductions down to about 4,000 kilowatt hours per year. Now, 20 million houses in 20 years is a huge task, but that's an enormous amount of jobs, and it's an investment, not a cost, because all of those houses will be there for another 25 years and will pay back the money you spent insulating. Transport, massive reductions. Basically driving around in a fossil-fueled car is about 18-20% efficient. We think, how can we reduce, firstly, the amount that we need to travel and then travel more efficiently? So, in the scenario, we looked at roughly 15% less miles, not massive. We can achieve that through having policies that encourage teleconferencing, people living closer to where they work, and reducing the amount of miles people travel, thinking about rethinking public transport systems like we've seen in cities like Freiburg to make it much easier to travel by train and by bus, get the buses to meet up with the trains so they're all run by the same company and so forth. So it's very easy to do that. But then we've also got to think about, as well as travelling less and travelling differently, is using more efficient systems. And electric vehicles are very much more efficient in terms of the amounts. It's about 3 times as far. So travelling less, travelling differently, about 35%. Improved efficiency can get us down to about 78%. You might notice the bit red at the bottom. We're actually reducing aviation because that's essential. But if we look at sort of the amount of aviation fuel we can make sustainably with a net zero production facility, it's the equivalent of being able to take a foreign holiday by aeroplane every couple of years for every citizen. It doesn't mean we'll never be able to visit our relatives in other parts of the world again, but we won't be flying to New York for a hen party sort of thing. So it's still available, but it's more rational, and it'll be more important and more exciting to do it rather than just become something that people do as a status symbol. And then looking at powering up, well, can we keep the lights on with 100% renewables was the question lots and lots of people asked us. And basically we did detailed modelling, 10 years worth of hourly data, 87,000 hours looking at supply and demand, modelling supply. So we take the outputs from offshore wind, we model that using the hourly NASA data that we have. We then extend that for the logical places to put further offshore. Then we add to that model onshore wind, wave, tidal, solar PV, geothermal, hydro. So we've got a detailed model of when the energy is available. We then model energy demand, looking at past electricity demand data from the grid, temperature data, typical patterns for when people charge cars, when people use domestic appliances and so on, and we build an hourly model for demand, and then cross the two to identify the periods of huge surplus and shortfall. When you've got that model, then you can tweak the installed capacity of different types of renewables to try and minimize the shortfalls and minimize the peaks. And when you think you've got it optimized, then we begin looking at what systems we can use to capture the huge amounts of surplus energy during the peaks and deploy them during the shortfalls. And it's absolutely fascinating. I could talk for 2.5 hours on that. But essentially, what we do for the core of it, there's lots of smaller things you can do for short-term things, moving loads, hydro systems, using thermal massive houses, but for the big bits that we really, really need to make sure that at -15 in the middle of the winter, when the winds stop for a week, we can still keep Britain warm and keep the lights on, is essentially take the big peaks and use that electricity in what they call sort of power to gas. You split water into hydrogen and oxygen. You could use the hydrogen as a storage fuel, but we haven't got a hydrogen power stations. We haven't got a hydrogen gas grid. We haven't got fleets of hydrogen lorries. So what you do is you capture carbon out of the atmosphere, add that to the hydrogen, and make synthetic methane that you can use in existing power stations, gas grids and so forth. You can also make synthetic transport fuels. And that's a technology that's on the up and up. There's a huge store-to-go project, 27 partners, 6 European countries looking at power-to-gas systems up to megawatts, really getting to understand that this is a growing technology, and they're predicting around about 2020 it's going to come into mass deployment. So in order to get traction on all of this, we produced a peer-reviewed paper in the Carbon Management Journal, got it through all the academic rigour, which you can download from our website and have a look. But basically, 82% of the time supply meets demand. There's an 18% shortfall. We can reduce that 18% down to about 15% by moving loads about and short-term storage, but that remaining 15% can be covered with power to gas. But if we're going to do that, we have to capture the carbon out of the atmosphere now to add to the hydrogen to make the synthetic methane to put into the gas system. So that requires land. So at that point in our research, we paused and we employed a professional dietitian to help us think about land. What are we doing with land? Laura Blake. She was really changed how I thought about food and diets and helped me understand we're actually eating too much food to be healthy. We're eating the wrong mix of foods, high fats and sugars foods, and we're wasting over 30% of the food in the process. So we looked at the sort of mix of the 4 key types of food: starchy foods, high protein, high fats and sugars, fruit and veg. Now the inner circle is the government's Eat Well plate of what we should be eating. 33% fruit and veg, 10% high fats and sugars. The outer circle is the average UK diet at the moment. 9% fruit and veg, 43% high fats and sugars. So it would be easy if we could convince everybody in the UK to be totally vegan to do it. But that's contravened one of our initial modelling assumptions. Let's try and make it as easy as possible for people to move into it. So we've devised a zero carbon Britain diet where people still eat meat, they still have milk, but they have the right amounts to actually be healthier according to the government's Eat Well plate statistics. So then we began modelling, well, how are we using land at the moment? Again, I could talk for a quarter of an hour at least about this, but essentially we modelled land use in the UK in 1 mega hectare blocks. We coloured them all these rather lurid colours, and in order to recognise what we use different parts of land for. Now, if we look at the land used for food for livestock, that's the yellow, the land that's grassland for livestock, what we're doing to feed the livestock is the yellow and the pink, which is a massive amount of UK agricultural land. It's about 85% of our agricultural land. So that's a huge amount. If we bring the high fats and sugars down to the right mix for a healthy human, bring the fruit and veg up, we can begin to reduce the yellow and the pink. We can reduce the amount of yellow and pink to free up land for capturing carbon either for biomass or to make synthetic fuels, adding to the hydrogen that we've captured from surplus renewables. we can use some of the yellow and pink to actually increase the net negatives, doubling the forest area, restoring peatlands, increasing the use of wood products. So essentially, we can move from the land use mix today to the land use mix we're suggesting in the zero carbon model, where we're freeing up land for energy and fuel and for carbon capture, whilst actually producing a greater percentage of our food and producing a better mix of food for people to eat. So we can move from where we were to a zero carbon model, where we've reduced the amount of emissions by removing fossil fuels, but reducing non-energy emissions by doing industry more efficiently, vastly reduced by using food and diets differently, but actually freeing up the land to increase the natural, sustainable carbon capture that Britain can achieve to bring us into balance. So we've got one model. We're not saying this is the only way of doing it. We actually put the model up on the website so you can tweak it yourself and have a look at different mixes of renewables. But in doing that modelling, we met all sorts of interesting modellers from around the world. And so in the run-up to Paris, we produced a report called Who's Getting Ready for Zero? Because we wanted to sort of pull it all together to show it's not just us saying this, there's lots of other people doing rapid decarbonisation work for their countries. And we presented this at the UN in Paris, and we looked at Chile, Costa Rica, Germany, all sorts of models. We found 100 different modelers from around the world doing all sorts of models. And we categorised them, whether they're government, non-government, sectoral, multi-sector. But overall, the scale of the deployment of renewables globally has exceeded anybody's expectations, and the falling costs is astounding. The falling price of installed solar PV, onshore wind, offshore wind, and showing that there are many, many different models that show we can do this at country level, at global level, at city level, is opening very powerful new conversations. So basically, the trend is our friend. Things are moving in the right direction, but the question is, will we get there in time? Because there's a clock ticking. We know we have to be at zero by, well, as early before mid-century as possible. So the last piece of research, we just decided to stop. We've done 3 detailed models. We could do another detailed model minute by minute over 100 years, but we feel we've proved that we can do it. So the new research was looking at what are the barriers and how do we overcome them? Because rather than an unresolved technical challenge, it's actually an economic, cultural and psychological barriers that's stopping us doing it. And changing how millions of people live is a complex problem. It's like a really knotty problem, because the forces that shape our lives exist on many different levels. There's the internal personal stuff. There's the sort of family pressures, social pressures, organisational pressures. What's the law? What does culture define that you do? So we began really to produce a sort of toolkit of ideas, which again, we've got the 6-page summary, so I'll rattle through it, but it's all here for you to read. And the whole thing's free to download from the website. And essentially we started looking at economics, psychology, sociology, lessons from history, democracy, law, spirit, arts. And one of the key things that came up for us is the concept of carbon lock-in. How we deliver energy, housing, transport, food has co-evolved with fossil fuels over 100 years. So there's all sorts of institutional lock-ins, technical lock-ins, cultural lock-ins. For example, the highly centralised method of providing electricity from a few spots is not the best method of delivering power, but we're sort of locked into it. Frameworks, institutions, financial support, investment models, consumer practices and cultural norms all think that that's how it happens. And it's hugely resistant to change, but fortunately there's all sorts of exciting change been demonstrated at community level. And I always need to skip this because you've got so many good examples here, but it's at community scale where you've got the flexibility to innovate new relationships with energy, food, transport and land use, and get the essential yes balancing the essential no to the things that we know we have to stop. And much has been learned. And examples that I've explored is things like Robin Hood Energy, where Nottingham City Council created its own energy company, not for the profit of shareholders, but simply to provide energy as cheaply as possible to the citizens. Another fascinating one is Energy Local in Bethesda, the Green Valleys Hydro, Chris Blake, where they've got a virtual private wire network, which is almost like a farmer's market for electricity, where the community hydro can sell to the people around it at a better price than they can buy from the grid, and it gives a better price to the hydro, which helps make hydros more viable. Or transport, looking at examples like York Bike Bells, 20% of men cycle around York area, only 10% of women were doing. The project looked at what's the barriers to getting more women bicycling, and it's had enormous power in confidence building, motivating people and getting more women on bikes. Buildings, looking at things like Energy Sprong, the revolutionary zero carbon funding approach to whole house refurbishment. Looking at food and diets like Bread Matters in Scotland, it's an institution that's a community benefit society to produce bread locally rather than a big food interest corporate. So there's lots and lots of good stuff happening on the ground, but we also had to look at, well, what are the wider systemic barriers that are stopping these things taking off and happening everywhere? So we began investigating things like politics and governance and the lobbying that's going on. It's a £2 billion industry, thousands of people involved, but there is a law on transferring of lobbying which is not really fit for purpose, but there are many examples from other countries of how you can actually make sure that the people who are having the lobbying done is transparent. We have to understand it and shine a light on it in order to change it. But it's not just lobbying, there's also the concept of revolving doors, where civil servants are moving in and out of big energy companies and back into the civil service to get something to happen, then back at a higher level. And we need the sort of advisory committee on business appointments, a CURBA, to begin to shine a light on people's movement in and out of this. But there are big reactions happening against it. One of the biggest is Plan B, which is a sort of charity of lawyers who are looking at these four areas: the country's legal government's actions, the liability of the big companies, and the liability of investors, and they're having a big difference. But also, it's changing politics and governments really means people coming together. And one of the best examples I've seen of a coalition for change was lots and lots of NGOs came together with lots of citizens and lots of assembly members to make sure that Wales passed a law called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Bill, which is now an act, which has a commissioner, ex-police complaints commissioner. Sophie Howe in Wales now scrutinises any Welsh Government legislation on its ability to support the well-being of future generations. Communications was another area we looked at. I mean, 90% of what we read or watch or listen to is 6 media giants, so we have to begin to challenge that and shine a light on that so people know that that's what's happening, which is why the news always seems to say the same thing. Then thinking about how social media can actually change that. We can take control of the media ourselves. Looked at an example of how essentially Lego was selling Shell-branded Lego kits in filling stations to kids, about getting kids excited about drilling for oil, and Greenpeace sort of did a "Everything's Not Awesome" video. It went viral, 6 million hits. Lego then switches their attitude, and they now have their Help Protect the Planet crew, where you're building wind farms out of Lego kits. So we can change things. But one of the big areas is economics and finance, and I got particularly drawn in when the International Monetary Fund came in, and they released a working paper in 2015 which calculated the invisible subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, 600 billion per annum. But if you add to that the health costs of damaging pollution and the future adaptation costs to climate, that's 5.3 trillion extra costs we should have paid for burning fossil fuels in 2015. Now, if the IMF is saying that, it's not like Greenpeace Amsterdam's think-in team is saying that. This is the core of capitalism. They know they have to change. And some of the fabulous new models that's arriving about thinking about economics and finance, if you've seen Donut Economics, it's well worth Googling it and having a look at the website. Fabulous 6 little videos that clearly explain a new mindset to economics. And the companies as well that are getting involved with all of this. Of course, a lot of companies now think about their ecological footprint, and they think, well, what is our footprint? but we're also, in terms of psychology and behaviour, encouraging them to think about their mind print. What are the values that you're enhancing with your advertising? Is it about consumerism? So it's not just your footprint, it's your mind print. But also, if we're going to think about psychology and behaviour change, you've got to think about the people who are managing a hospital, very busy people, people managing school, head teachers. If you want them to behave differently, you have to support them. So we're working with a group called Carbon Literacy, where what they do is they train the trainers. They train people from the health sector to become carbon literate trainers. Then they run a one-day training workshop for anybody from that sector who learns from somebody who's also from that sector, understands the sector, and gives them a one-day carbon literacy training so they have the basic skills they need to make decisions differently. But also the positive examples, we looked at the Green Open Homes. I mean, it's sort of like 600 homes has had 10,000 visitors to super retrofitted high insulation homes. So it begins to make it normal to people. So you can see that it's something that you could begin to imagine for yourself. Thinking about changing values as well. That's really, really important, is what we value and the values that we hold. And this is some fabulous research. There's a chap I work with quite a lot called Tom Compton, who's done a lot on Common Cause. And well, we were working with him around Manchester and looked at some of the work that they've done, exploring values, which I think this is possibly one of the most important slides of the whole lot. Shared Values for the City's Region is a report they produced. And it helps unpick a really, really important thing. 74% of people actually, when asked, place greater importance on compassionate values rather than selfish values. But 77% of the people believe their fellow citizens hold selfish values to be more important than compassionate values. We all think very similarly, but we have to understand that we have to break the barriers and share that. So basically, there are many, many different solutions. The overarching conclusion is we have to do it together, and I've been working with zero carbon groups across the UK to begin to explore that. So I said I'd end in 30 minutes. I've just come to exactly 30 minutes. Thank you very much. So help yourself to this summaries at the back, and if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
And we'll send can we share the presentation with everyone?